Vivian Heidi from House of Heidi, and this is archive.exe. Today we're going over the case of the missing Frog Boys. The date was March 26, 1991. The place? Daegu, South Korea. The day was a national holiday. South Korea held its first local elections after democracy, and 5 elementary school boys left their homes that day because it was a national holiday, so there was no school, and they were in the residential neighborhood of Daegu. Their names were Kim Jun-sik, who was 9 years old, Park Chan-in, 10 years old, Kim Yong-young, 11 years old, Jo Ho-yeon, 12 years old, and Woo Chil-won, 13 years old. And I apologize if I mispronounced any of those. Around 9 a.m., the boys left their homes in the Seongseo, which is now the Daelseo area of Daegu, just one of the residential neighborhoods. 13-year-old Woo Chul-won briefly returned home to exchange his light jacket for a heavier one. His father watched him leave that second time, expecting him to be back before dinner. But it was the last time he ever saw his son. Approximately around 9:05 to 9:20 a.m., the boys met up and began walking towards Mount Waryeong, which was only a couple kilometers from their neighborhood. So the residential neighborhood was just right here, and then the mountain was just there. And I'm currently in Daegu, and I can attest that their neighborhoods are just right next to the mountain. So the mountain wasn't a dangerous thing or anything. This was quite a normal thing for the boys to do. And they carried simple items suitable for a day of exploring, not camping or running away, which we will talk about later, that there was some theories about that. But yeah, they just carried like a container to collect salamander eggs, which is what they were going to the mountain to do. And they just thought it was going to be a normal day. They didn't have school, so they just wanted to hang out with each other and go collect some salamander eggs. And another thing to note is that these 5 boys were lifelong friends. Like they were together all the time. They all lived in this circle of houses. All 5 of the boys and their families lived in like a circle of houses on a street. And so they were very, very close. And it was quite normal for them to always play together. Approximately 9:20 to 9:40 a.m., there was a witness that encountered the boys and asked where they were going. They reportedly replied that they were going to collect salamander eggs, like I previously mentioned. This is the last widely accepted confirmed sighting of all 5 boys together. They were never seen alive again. The media initially reported that the boys were collecting frog eggs, leading to the mistaken moniker of the Frog Boys, which still persists today. Like, even today, they're still known as Frog Boys, even though they were collecting salamander eggs. Shortly after 1 p.m., Woo Cheung-won's father received a phone call from his son's Taekwondo academy. The instructors of the academy reported that he had missed practice. But since it was a holiday, the absence did not seem initially alarming by the instructors or even by the father. Like the father thought that his son might have just lost track of time hanging out with his friends up in the mountains. Approximately 1:15 to around 3 p.m., the parents began checking with neighbors and friends and kind of checking with each other to see where their sons were. Like the father that had gotten the phone call asked the neighbors, which are the parents of the other boys, and then they were kind of asking around, asking if anyone had seen them. And they discovered that none of the 5 boys had returned home, and at this point, the families realized that all 5 children were missing. In the late afternoon, relatives, all the families searched nearby in neighborhood streets, the streams nearby, fields, and the lower slopes of the mountain. They expected that the boys had simply wandered further than intended, but no trace of them was found. In the evening, as darkness approached, the parents contacted the police. Once they realized that they couldn't find their sons, they contacted the police, and eventually a missing persons report was filed. We'll get more into this in a little bit, but the police did not take this case seriously at first. But the first organized searches were to begin that night, and they searched through the night. Within the next several days, hundreds of officers joined the search once they kind of took it more seriously. and the operation expanded to include soldiers, helicopters, volunteers, and eventually over 300,000 personnel. Millions of flyers were distributed, and most of those flyers were from the parents themselves going out into the community, into all of South Korea, actually, not just Daegu, um, telling the public that their children were missing. But despite repeated searches of the mountain, the boys were not found. And there is a documentary about this case in Korean. So I don't speak Korean, so I watched with the subtitles on. But the documentary explained that with the helicopters that flew, uh, they would fly so close to the mountain because the mountain itself is not that large. It's about 300 kilometers tall. And so they were able to fly really close to the mountain where they could see very small details. And in the documentary, one of the fathers said that you could see a cigarette case that like they could see that small of something, and they found nothing related to the boys at all in all their searches. So in late March of 1991, the media didn't cover the case at first because the focus was on the elections. Because remember that day, the first Democratic elections were happening, and everyone, of course, was very excited for it. And so they wanted to know, who had won and everything. So the media wasn't covering the case at first because they believed, as the police believed as well, that the boys were either that they were runaways, which didn't make any sense because they did not, like I said, they did not bring anything to uh, to show that they were running away. All they brought were some containers to hold salamander eggs. But eventually, they realized that the boys were not runaways, and the search quickly became one of the largest in South Korean history. As I had said before, 300,000 police officers, soldiers, and volunteers participated. And the president at the time ordered an extensive nationwide search. Like he went on the national news and talked about this case and ordered everyone to be searching for them. Helicopters, military units, search dogs, and thousands of civilians searched the mountain. And again, the mountain's not that big. Like I can attest to it. I've seen the mountain in person. And it's not a very big mountain at all. So the fact that so many people were searching and nothing was found is quite alarming, really. Television stations covered the search live for weeks, so they got a lot of media coverage. Eventually, they did. As time wore on, they got a lot of media coverage, and it was the biggest case at the time in South Korea. So from 1991 to 2002, thousands of tips were investigated because of all that media coverage. A lot of people, over 500 tips actually, based on the documentary, over 500 tips had come in just at first. Um, and the police apparently, the police investigated every single tip. Who really knows? But I'm sure they did the best they could, and they were investigating kidnapping theories, runaway theories, and numerous false confessions as well. And psychics and shamans were consulted. And this is a big thing in South Korea, especially back then, but even in today's world. Shamanism is a big thing in South Korean culture. Uh, Again, not more so back then, but even now it's still prevalent, but more so just it's not as talked about, I think. I'm no expert or anything, but from what I gathered, that's what's happening with that. But a lot of shamans were consulted, and they would get a lot of false tips, and the parents would get excited and like feel hopeful, and then it turned out to be nothing. So that was quite issue that they had to deal with, but they pressed on. And as time went on, age progressed, images were distributed nationwide showing what the boys would look like a few years older. And the boys' families continued searching for more than a decade. 11 years. The fathers quit their jobs to focus on finding their children. Right at first, they quit their jobs and they went all around South Korea to raise awareness of their missing children. So, yeah, as I said, the fathers became investigators. Rather than returning to normal life, the boys' fathers devoted years to searching for their sons. They quit, and some of them reduced their work, but almost all of them quit, at least for some time. They quit their work. They traveled around South Korea chasing leads. All those 500 tips that came in, they would go and chase those leads and try to figure it out. Um, Again, the police, they did what they could, and But the parents, the fathers, really did a lot, and they chased those leads all around the country. They even went to different neighboring islands because South Korea is it's small, but I mean it's still a country, but they would go to other islands that were nearby as well, because there were some leads about that, but nothing came of it. And they appeared constantly on television to keep the case in the public eye, and they personally organized searches when official efforts slowed. And here's a picture of a van or like a truck that they had bought that they put pictures of all five boys saying that they're missing, all the information about the boys' disappearance, and they would drive this truck all around South Korea. And the funny thing is, again, I live here right now in Daegu, and I see trucks like these, not this particular one, of course, but I see trucks like these with other kinds of information on it. So this is quite a common occurrence. They would drive around to kind of raise awareness, and they would use a loudspeaker to talk about the case and to raise awareness of the boys' disappearances. In 1996, a criminal psychology professor from America publicly claimed that Kim Jong Sik's father had murdered all five children and buried them beneath his own house. The theory was based largely on the belief that the father couldn't fully account for several hours on the day that the boys had disappeared. So there was about 3 hours that couldn't really be accounted for him. But despite the lack of physical evidence, so the only kind of thing he had for his theory was this 3 hours. So despite the lack of physical evidence, the accusation exploded across South Korea, and it's explained that by the parents that and the forensic expert that talked a lot about this case explained by them that this accusation kind of was accepted by the public, by the police, because this psychology professor was from America. So they kind of, especially back then, they kind of were like, "Ooh, he's from America. He knows what he's talking about," which is so silly, so ridiculous. But so police arrived. So police acted on this, and they arrived with. I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. They arrived with heavy equipment and excavated the family's home. And they showed this in the documentary as well, that they literally ripped up floors, tore down the walls, parts of the bathroom were demolished. Investigators searched every inch of the property while television cameras documented the entire ordeal. So this was documented and put on television. So the whole country thought that that the father had done it. For a brief moment, investigators believed that they had found a clue when they uncovered a pair of children's shoes. But the shoes belonged to the father himself and had no connection to the case. After tearing apart the house, police found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no crime scene. The accusations collapsed, but the damage had already been done. Kim Jong Sik's father had been publicly branded as a man who murdered his own son. His reputation was shattered, his home left damaged, not just damaged, like completely destroyed, and his family endured another unimaginable trauma, this time at the hands of the investigation itself. The professor who made the accusation was later fined for defamation after the allegations proved to be completely unsupported. Which, yeah, he should be. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. Years later, when the boys' remains were discovered on Mount Moryang, which we'll get into, it became painfully clear that the excavation of the father's home had been a mistake. For many people following the case, this became one of the clearest examples of how desperation and public pressure can push an investigation towards innocent people instead of the truth. So, as I had kind of mentioned before, the police initially leaned towards a runaway or a kidnapping theory because there was no obvious crime scene, like literally nothing was found on the mountain. Investigators spent years treating the case primarily as a missing person or kidnapping investigation. So that meant that thousands of ransom calls were investigated because the case was so publicized. There were a lot of fake ransom calls, and the parents were repeatedly told that their children might still be alive. Search efforts became spread across the country instead of remain focused on the mountain, and many critics believe this delayed the homicide investigation. And the parents received lots of cruel hoax calls, One of the most heartbreaking details is that several days after the disappearance, someone phoned in claiming to have the boys, and this is when they had that big television appearance where there was a bunch of people on call. You could call in for tips and everything. So a bunch of people right there, and in the documentary, it showed the mother running up to one of the ladies on the phone. Um, and it turned out to be a hoax, of course. But the caller reportedly said, "I have the children," and then also uh, you could hear the son's voice, and the mother even said that it was her son's voice. So I don't know what that was about. Maybe she was just feeling so emotional that she thought it was her son's voice. I don't really know. They didn't really go too much into that, but apparently it was a hoax and he demanded money, but as I said, it turned out to be a hoax. Unfortunately, it was one of the many false leads that the families endured. So on September 26, 2002, 11 years later, two local men were on Mount Waryong, the mountain, collecting acorns, and they would use these acorns to make a traditional Korean acorn jelly. They noticed old, weathered children's clothing among the rocks. Looking closer, they saw what appeared to be human bones protruding from the ground. They contacted authorities immediately. Some reports say they first made an anonymous call to the police, which led to the recovery of the remains. And in the documentary that I keep mentioning, The Search of the Frog Boys, they simply describe them as two locals hiking and gathering acorns. It doesn't identify them by name or interview them at all. And I kind of wondered why weren't their names released? And there's never been an official explanation, but here's a few reasons why. In South Korea, the privacy is a very, very big thing. So the identities of the civilians in major public criminal cases are often withheld unless they choose themselves to speak publicly about it. And relating to that, protection from media attention, the Frog Boys case attracted an enormous public interest. Revealing their identities could have subjected them to scrutiny. And they were not suspects, according to the police. And according to everything, they're not suspects. They were treated as the discoverers of the remains, not persons of investigative interest. So on September 26, 2002, the investigators found skeletal remains of all five boys together, clothing and personal belongings, empty cartridge cases. There had been a debate over their relevance to the deaths, which we'll get into. Several skulls showed injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, and experts concluded that the boys did not simply die of exposure, which we'll get into that again in a little bit. And police eventually announced that the deaths were most likely homicides. But let's get more into it though. So first of all, the bodies were found close to civilization. The boys' remains were found on Mount Waryong, only a few kilometers from their neighborhood, not deep in the remote wilderness. And like I said, the mountain's not that big. That fact shocked investigators and the public because the mountain had been searched repeatedly over the years. It raised the question, how could five bodies remain undiscovered for more than a decade? And the bodies weren't like buried really deep or anything. These two hikers just found them in the rocks. So it's this I have questions about that. It's quite strange. So here are a few iffy things that happened during this discovery of the remains. The scene was not secured immediately, and this is verified from the documentary, from the police, from as we'll get into it, a forensic expert as well. So when the remains were discovered on September 26, 2002, the area quickly became crowded. And in this documentary, it showed video footage of the crime scene on so many people, not just the parents. The parents did eventually come as well, but just crowds of people were around, like civilians, not investigators. Civilians were just there, and they had blocked it off, but they were just all right there, and it was getting contaminated quickly because you don't like just because the skeletal remains are found in one area. There could be other things going on. There could be other evidence that you hadn't found yet, that they hadn't found yet, that could have gotten contaminated or never found at all. So, according to investigators and the families, police officers, reporters, local officials, curious onlookers were allowed close to the scene before it had been fully documented. And in a modern a modern homicide investigation, the area would normally be sealed off immediately to preserve footprints, fibers, tool marks, and other trace evidence. Like I said, there was probably a lot of, from what I can guess, there's probably a lot that wasn't found or put into evidence because of the fact that the scene wasn't secured. And nowadays, the police in Daegu and in all of South Korea, they have a lot of different, you know, best practices that are followed much better nowadays, of course. So potential evidence wasn't fully documented. Reports indicate that items found near the remains included children's clothing, personal belongings, and cartridges cases. One criticism is that the precise locations and relationships of these items were not documented as thoroughly as they could have been before recovery. That makes later reconstruction of the scene much more difficult. So all besides the remains themselves, all the other things weren't documented correctly, and once the forensics experts came, because at first it was just the police that were doing the documentation. Once the forensics experts came, they realized the police were not doing the documentation right at all. So all of the stuff that the police had documented couldn't be used, like at all. So the forensics experts could only use and figure out what's going on based on what they excavated themselves. So everything else before that was just couldn't be used, which I don't fully understand why, because of course for evidence like in court or anything, you couldn't use it, but I don't understand why they couldn't have used it to kind of figure out what's going on. Maybe they did, and I don't know, but and plus in this case it's never even gone to court. A little bit of a spoiler, but it's never even gone to court, so I don't know why they couldn't use that evidence to at least figure out what happened, but maybe it was damaged or something by the police, who knows. So the bodies were removed before, like I said, before a complete forensic examination. One of the biggest criticisms came from forensic specialists involved in the case. Instead of spending an extended period documenting exact positions, the surrounding vegetation, soil layers, because again, it had been 11 years, so there had been changes in the soil and everything, and the relationship between the remains and nearby objects, the remains were recovered relatively quickly and transported for examination. That meant all that contextual evidence may have been lost forever, or was lost forever, honestly. And I didn't want to include this picture in this in this video, but the documentary does talk about show like actual video footage of the police doing this, and they literally had, and I'm not even exaggerating, they had newspapers set out, and um, they would recover the remains, the skeletal remains, and just throw it on the newspaper. And I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. They would separate it by they would put all the skulls in one pile, all the long bones like the femurs and everything in another pile, and they would separate it that way. Instead of when you separate it, you would try to reconstruct the whole body, like the skull, the vertebrae, and you would reconstruct it that way. But instead, they were separating it by here's all the skulls, here's all the femurs, here's I don't know what they were doing. Again, this was, back in the day. Things are different now, but and we'll talk more about that too. The police are much better about it now, but it's so ridiculous. And even the forensic expert that talked about how just absolutely ridiculous this was. So the clothing became a point of controversy. Some clothing was reportedly found arranged or tied in unusual ways. So, and this was right when they were excavating it, and they had the parents. The parents were there as the whole public was there, but the parents were there as they were excavating, and you could see on in the document like firsthand footage of this poor mother who was crying and holding also laughing because it's so ridiculous. She was holding up her son's shirt that was tied. It was so the sleeves were just tied like this, and it was tied together like this, but like actually tied. Like I can't do it because I'm wearing my shirt, but like it was tied. The sleeves were tied together. So obviously, I mean, who knows exactly what happened, but it seemed like it was after the fact the sleeves were tied and just kind of thrown on the remains. And it was quite strange. And she was crying, showing it to the camera, saying, "How could this happen? What's going on? This isn't right." It's just ridiculous. First of all, that's awful that the mom had to go through that, but it's ridiculous that the this evidence was just it can't be evidence anymore. Like it can't that. no one could do anything with it because it was contaminated, you know? But the families argued that this suggested human involvement. I mean, obviously, right? Because the scene was disturbed during recovery, later investigators could not be certain whether the clothing's exact position reflected events at the time of death or had been altered over the 11 years by weather, animals, or the recovery efforts. So I don't know how a shirt could be tied like that because of weather or animals, but who knows? Maybe something did happen during recovery efforts where it was tied like that, or that's what happened at the time of death. I don't know. No one knows, which is ridiculous. But so did the police contaminate the scene? There is no public evidence that the police intentionally destroyed evidence. However, many experts, the forensics experts, believe they failed to preserve it according to modern forensic standards, especially by allowing too many people into the area, recovering remains before exhaustive scene documentation, like taking the pictures, having the exact coordinates of things, stuff like that, and making premature public statements about hypothermia before the forensic examination was complete. So the police, when the remains were discovered, the next day, I'm not sure, the next day or a couple days after, they made a public statement, press coverage of it, and the police said that it was hypothermia. Laughing because it's so ridiculous, but they said that the boys died from hypothermia from the weather and everything. And the fact, first of all, like I previously mentioned, there was bullets with the bones, with the bodies. There was bullets, and there was obvious head trauma, which wasn't caused by bullets. We'll get more into that. But there was head trauma and bullets at the scene. And one of the boys' shirts was tied, like he couldn't tie himself. It was, and the fact that they said it was hypothermia is absolutely ridiculous. But that's what they initially said, and that's just silly. It's just so silly. So the police initially announced hypothermia. I say verified that the police had done that, and there's actual footage of them saying that in the press conference. Within hours, oh yeah, within hours of the discovery, the police publicly suggested that the boys had probably become lost, died of exposure, and remained undiscovered for years. And of course, the parents and most of the public immediately rejected that conclusion. And first of all, I want to say as well that this had happened in March, but it doesn't get that cold, especially in Daegu. Daegu is surrounded by mountains, and so it's kind of like a bowl. So like heat kind of gets trapped inside, you know. So it wasn't that cold. Even in March, which is still like spring, early spring, and that day specifically, it did not get that cold out. So the fact that they would die from exposure just doesn't make any sense. And the fact that they remained undiscovered for years when they had searched that mountain completely is also very, very sketchy. So later, forensic experts from the university identified injuries to several skulls consistent with blunt force trauma and concluded the deaths were homicides, contradicting that early accidental death theory. So again, like I said, there was blunt force trauma to the skulls that, well, were also not caused by bullets, which is quite strange. We're going to get more into that as well. So, but they've seen this blunt force trauma. And so this is a criticism from forensic expert Che Jong-min. One of the most outspoken critics was forensic scientist Che Jong-min, who participated in examining the remains. His criticism wasn't simply that police made mistakes. His concern was that once a scene is disturbed, it can never be recreated. Examples of evidence that can be permanently lost include shoe impressions, drag marks, vegetation indicating whether bodies were moved, soil transfer, insect evidence, and the original spatial relationship between every object. But by the time later forensic experts began asking these questions, many answers were no longer recoverable. And yeah, so like I said earlier, I had questioned whether why can't the forensic experts just kind of still use that evidence that the police had excavated already. They did. They were still looking at the skulls and the other skeletal remains, but this kind of stuff, there's no recovering it. You can't go back and get it because it was already destroyed. Once you disturb the scene, you can't go back and figure it out. It's already gone. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what happened afterwards, and then we're going to dive more into some of the theories and things as well. So from 2003 to 2005, investigators explored numerous suspects and theories. No arrests were made, and no suspect was officially identified. Like, no suspect was ever officially confirmed or anything like that. March 25th, 2006, under the law at the time, the statute of limitations expired, preventing a prosecution if a subject was identified afterwards. But in July of 2015, South Korea abolished the statute of limitations for first degree murder. Although the original limitation had already expired before the law change, authorities continued reviewing evidence and pursuing investigative leads. And in 2019, Daegu police announced a renewed review of the case using modern forensic methods and a re examination of old evidence. So now that's why I said earlier the police, of course, this was back in 1991 and 2002. It's going to be different police nowadays, you know. So now the police have renewed the case and are using modern forensic methods to kind of look it all over again. And in 2021, Daegu installed the Frog Boy Memorial and Children's Safety Prayer Monument near the mountain to commemorate the victims. And in 2026, the case remains officially unsolved. Annual memorial services continue, and families have called for the release of investigative records and the creation of a truth commission. Police have stated that they continue renewing evidence with modern forensic techniques. So that's where we are with the case. There's been no resolution at all. The police are still investigating it. But let's get more into some of the theories surrounding this case. So, theory one, they were murdered by one or more adults. This is the most supported theory, and let's get into it. When the remains were discovered in 2002, several skulls showed injuries that forensic experts said were consistent with blunt force trauma. So, not bullet wounds, but blunt force trauma, like something hitting the head. The bodies of all five boys were found together. Investigators concluded that they were unlikely to have simply died from exposure or became lost. Police eventually, like I said, eventually treated the case as a homicide. So some possible scenarios are the boys witnessed something they shouldn't have, they encountered a violent stranger, or they encountered someone they knew who turned violent. Some problems were no DNA or fingerprints identified a suspect, no murder weapon has ever been publicly identified, and no credible eyewitness placed another person with the boys after the last confirmed sighting. The status of this is that this is the leading investigative theory because authorities concluded that the deaths were homicide. So this is very broad, of course. Like this could be anybody, anything, but this is the most accepted thing. Basically, this is all the investigators know for sure. Um, but I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. But to talk a little bit more on the murder weapon, nothing's ever been identified, but the forensic experts did say that it was something that was like a square shape. So based on the trauma on the head, like based on the markings on the skull, but they could never really figure out exactly what that would be. Theory two is a military or hunting accident, and this is one of the most discussed theories in South Korea. So, why people believe it? The mountain was reportedly used for military training exercises around that time, and hunting also occurred in the area. And at the time, there was a Korean military base right near the area where the boys disappeared. And there was actually a shooting range right near the pond where the boys were supposed to be going for the salamander egg hunting. So, that was a huge thing that the public, the parents, the public really believed was that it was the military were somehow involved. And nowadays that base isn't here anymore. The shooting range isn't there anymore, but back then it was there. So supporters suggest that the boys were accidentally shot from the shooting range, or again maybe from a hunting accident. But the shooting range was like the biggest thing that people believed, and those responsible panicked. The bodies were concealed to avoid criminal liability. People also point to reports that spent cartridge cases were found near the remains, on the remains, though investigators have never publicly established that the cartridge cases were connected to the boys' deaths. Because remember, um, the police had kind of messed up the excavation, and so those cases, those bullet casings weren't a part of it all, of the official excavation, I guess. And problems were that there was no confirmed forensic evidence showing that the boys died from gunshot wounds. The cartridge cases may have been unrelated, like maybe they had just fallen and they were just there. That's what they say. The military has denied involvement, and no documents or witnesses have substantiated a cover up. So the status is plausible to some observers, but unproven. Theory three, they died from exposure. I put this here just on its own because it's just so ridiculous. This was considered early in the investigation by the police. The idea was that the boys became lost, succumbed to the cold, and their bodies were overlooked. After the remains were examined, investigators concluded that the injuries were inconsistent with a simple accidental death and shifted to treating the case as a homicide. And so nowadays, thankfully, it's generally rejected by investigators. Theory four, now this is more about the remains themselves. The police missed the bodies during the original search. This isn't a theory about the murders themselves, but about why the boys were not found for more than 11 years, which, when you think about it, is absolutely ridiculous. Like, the mountain itself is not that big, and there was extensive search efforts. The fact that they were not found in 11 years is crazy. So crazy. The remains were eventually discovered on the mountain in an area that had reportedly been searched before. So possible explanations include searchers overlooked the difficult terrain, which in my opinion doesn't make sense because the terrain's not that difficult. Like, I've literally been on these mountains. It's not, I mean, it's, it can be a trek, of course. I'm not denying that at all, but it's not like Mount Everest or something. Like, it's a pretty typical mountain. The dense vegetation obscured the sites. That could be true. There is a lot of bushes and trees and everything. But again, if you're searching for missing boys, you're not just gonna, oh, there's some trees over there. I'm just gonna walk by. You're gonna look. The remains became more visible over time because of erosion or changing foliage. So this is saying that maybe the boys were buried and they couldn't see them, and it became visible because of the erosion, which could be possible. But they also had search dogs. So I don't know how. I don't know. I don't know. The bodies were removed after the initial searches, and in my opinion, that's what I think happened. But of course, no definitive evidence has established which explanation is correct. But I personally think that the bodies were moved and placed there after the searches were concluded. Theory five. Here's more on this. The bodies were moved. Some people believe the boys were elsewhere and later placed where they were found. Supporters argue that the site had reportedly been searched before, and finding all five together years later seems unusual to them. So they're kind of talking about like all five together like that, in a very shallow grave. Again, it was really just rocks. They weren't even really buried. So all five of them together like that is unusual because of after 11 years there would be animals there and everything, and the weather, the remains would kind of spread out a little bit. Like, animals would take the remains, things like that. So the fact that they're all together like that is quite strange. However, forensic investigators have not publicly confirmed that the remains were moved after death, so the status is unproven. Some common misconceptions about the case. Several claims are repeated online but are not established facts. The boys were definitely beaten to death. The publicly available forensic evidence indicates injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, but the exact cause and sequence of injuries has not been established. So yes, the forensic expert did say that there was blunt force trauma to the head, but it's not definitive. Like, there's no real answer to the case. The military covered it up. There is no publicly verified evidence supporting this claim as well. A local hunter confessed. So this was multiple confessions happened with this, that local hunters were confessing over the years, but none were proved credible. So I don't know why people do that, false confessions, but none of them were credible. The police knew who did it. No public evidence supports this assertion either, especially so long after this occurred. You would think, with a whole new police team and everything, that if they did know, they would, kind of want to figure it out. But so I don't think that's true. I think at the time the police were just kind of incompetent, and so they kind of just messed things up. And who knows? but uh, all these are common misconceptions. So, which theory has the strongest evidentiary support based on the publicly available evidence? So this is just based on the evidence. This isn't conclusive at all. But the boys were victims of homicide supported by forensic findings and the official direction of the investigation. The perpetrator was likely someone they encountered on or near the mountain. A reasonable inference, but not proven, because of course they had gone to the mountain and they were never seen again. So we're inferring that whatever happened happened on the mountain. The identity, motive, and precise circumstances remains unknown. The most dramatic theories, the military cover-ups, serial killers, or organized conspiracies, have attracted attention over the years, but none have been substantiated by publicly released evidence. And to talk a little bit more on the serial killers, there was this one serial killer in Korea, very famous one, who had done his crimes in an area near Daegu. Not, I mean, South Korea itself is pretty small, but he had confessed to a bunch of these crimes around the same time that this happened. But he never confessed to these missing boys or anything, and it's never been like connected or anything like that. But people tried to connect it. So here's something that happened that was talked about in the documentary, and this was like a first-hand account by the parents were talking about it. Quite strange. The military, in my opinion, quite strange. The military's supernatural powers incident. Around 3 years after the boys disappeared, around 1994, the parents were unexpectedly contacted by the South Korean military and told to come to a nearby military camp urgently. And this is all alleged. This is the parents themselves talked about this on the documentary. So this is from the parents themselves. But again, the military, they never talked about this, just the parents. So according to Woo Jung-woo, the father of Woo Cheong-won, the soldiers told the parents something to the effect of they would be given supernatural powers, like the military would give them supernatural powers, and whoever received them would be able to locate the missing children. And according to the father that spoke about this, a shaman touched the head of one of the mothers, and suddenly she jumped up and ran to the mountain, leading the others. She stopped at a spot on the mountain, but no bodies or clues were discovered. The military never, I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous. The military never explained why they did this, and the parents were just left heartbroken and confused. And such a strange incident that occurred. I wonder where exactly she stopped at. Maybe years later, that's where the bodies were found. I don't know. I'm not saying that that's true or anything. I'm just saying I wonder where the spot was that she had stopped. So, why would the military do this? No official explanation has ever been publicly released, so any answer is speculative. Researchers and commentators have suggested several possibilities. So one is a genuine belief in folk spiritual practices. Even in the 1990s, consulting shamans, fortune tellers, and psychics were not uncommon in South Korea during desperate missing person investigations. And just in general, shamans and psychics and things like that are quite common. Even today, I like not today specifically, but even in today's time, I like would walk down the street in Daegu, and they have lots of like psychics, not lots, but like psychics and stuff. Little shops that you can go into. I mean, even in back in the States, they have that, of course, but it's just interesting to see that it's still a cultural thing here. So, an attempt to comfort or placate the parents. Someone within the military may have believed this unconventional approach was worth trying because all conventional searches had failed. And poor judgment by individual personnel. There is no evidence that this was part of an official military policy or a coordinated government program. I personally think that maybe some like it says here, some people in the military just wanted to help, maybe. Um, so they want to do this, or again, this is alleged. This is my personal belief that maybe the military were involved in it somehow, and they were feeling bad, and they wanted to. I don't know. I don't know. That's all alleged. I don't know, but who knows? Why this incident fueled conspiracy theories. Because the boys' remains were eventually found near an area associated with military activity, many people later viewed this strange encounter with suspicion. So I'm not the only one who thinks it. Some wondered whether the military were trying to distract the parents or gain their trust. However, there is no publicly verified evidence linking this supernatural powers incident to the boy's death or to a military cover up. So again, this is all alleged. Nothing's been proven. There's nothing to really show any kind of military involvement, except for the fact that the base was near there. But I mean, a lot of places were near there, you know. So it's this. It just the event is documented through the father's testimony, but its purpose remains unknown. So this might not even have happened, or maybe it happened but they're misremembering it. Who knows? Who knows? This event is one reason the Frog Boys case has such an unusual place in South Korean true crime history. It combined a massive criminal investigation with desperate searches, false leads, psychic claims, and unconventional efforts that reflected both the family's desperation and the atmosphere surrounding the case. The case changed South Korea. The Frog Boys case transformed how missing child investigations are handled in South Korea. It led to greater public awareness of missing children, more media attention devoted to missing persons cases, improvements in search coordination and investigative procedures over time. So the ridiculous situation that happened with the police excavation wouldn't happen again. Although the case itself remains unsolved, it became a turning point in public expectations of law enforcement. And the mountain still carries the memory of the case. Today, visitors to Mount Woryong can find memorials dedicated to the boys. Every March, people continue to remember them, and the case remains one of South Korea's most recognizable unsolved crimes. And one detail that continues to puzzle investigators. Among all the unanswered questions, one stands out. If the boys were killed on or near the mountain, why were they not found despite one of the largest search operations in Korean history? There are several possibilities. Searches missing a concealed location, changes in the terrain over 11 years, or the remains being moved, but no publicly available evidence has definitely established which explanation is correct. That uncertainty is one of the reasons the Frog Boys case continues to be debated more than 3 decades later. So many investigators have wondered whether today's technology could have produced more answers if the scene had been processed differently. In 2002, investigators had far fewer options than today for environmental DNA, advanced trace fiber analysis, high resolution 3D crime scene mapping, and refined soil and pollen comparisons. If the original scene had been preserved with modern standards in mind, it's possible more forensic evidence could have been recovered, as well as the police excavating it properly and letting the forensic experts do their job. That doesn't mean the case would necessarily have been solved, but many experts believe that the investigation lost valuable opportunities when the discovery site was handled the way it was. So, what remains unknown? The exact minute the boys entered Mount Waryoung, who, if anyone, they encountered, where they spent their final hours, and whether they died on March 26th or later, whether they were killed where the remains were eventually found or moved there afterwards, and of course, who was responsible. These gaps are why the Frog Boys case remains one of South Korea's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Even with modern forensic review, the sequence of events between the last confirmed sighting that morning and the families realizing the boys were missing later that day cannot be reconstructed with certainty. 35 years later, the Frog Boys case remains officially unsolved. What we know is surprisingly little. Basically, everything I covered, that's what we know. 5 boys entered Mount Woryong on the morning of March 26, 1991. They were seen alive only once after leaving home. 11 years later, the remains were discovered on the same mountain after one of the largest search operations in South Korean history. The evidence pointed investigators towards homicide, but not towards a suspect. Everything else exists somewhere between evidence, inference, and speculation. Theories continue to circulate: an unknown killer, an accident, a cover up, but none have been proven. As with many unsolved investigations, the absence of answers creates space for stories. The challenge is separating these stories from the facts. Maybe the missing piece is still sitting in an overlooked witness statement. Maybe it disappeared with evidence that was never properly preserved. Or maybe the truth has been lost to time. Until new evidence emerges, the Frog Boys case remains open, not in the courts, but in the minds of investigators, journalists, and the families who never stopped searching. This has been archive.exe. Case file The Frog Boys. Status unresolved.